Okay, on the show today, Natalie Orr. Natalie's a dance expert. She done some work with me. I've been on her podcast, so we've been chatting a bit already. Natalie, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
How did you get into embodiment?
Oh, I got into embodiment because at some point in my dance life, I realized that I had an incredible ability to manipulate my body and very little connection to my body. And it started to manifest in different physical symptoms. I developed endometriosis and also emotional symptoms, realizing that I was always carrying tension like towards myself, towards other people, and also tension in my body. So it came out of pain, out of necessity.
Pain and suffering. That's what gets into this stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. So we've had some dance on before. We've talked about some other episodes, but may or may not have heard. But there is this sort of almost like stereotype, like, hey, dancers are wonderfully embodied, they're in their bodies, they're, because they can move. So they're really nice embodied people. Should we set people straight about that?
Yeah, okay, sure. I think it depends very much on the environment where you learn to dance.
Right.
In some dances, I could be embodied. So, for example, I used to do Ceilidh dancing, like with my Scottish side of the family at New Year. And then I was fully embodied, having a great time, not worried about what it looked like. So there is that part. Dance is a great portal for embodiment. But at the same time, when it came to my dance training, like in my degree where I was training contemporary, and then later when I came back to ballet and trained in ballet as an adult, there wasn't a lot of space for embodiment because you were supposed to be pushing through the pain. And so you don't really want to feel the pain at the same time. So you just kind of take a separation there.
And this can be true for people with emotional trauma, for athletes in a lot of physical pain, just pushing through injuries. And, people listening to this may think dance, they may think 5 rhythms, they might think conscious dance, or they might think, ballet, classical dance, or contemporary, right? Just things falling off my desk today. I can hear the background noise. So, I'm aware people have those different associations, and it's quite a brutal world in some ways, the modern dance world in a lot. Maybe we should also define modern contemporary, because they're not words that not everyone knows.
Sure. So from my understanding, it depends where you are in the world, but modern dance, I believe, is what Americans refer to as, what we British refer to as contemporary dance. And so this was the movement away from ballet that kind of was like, we're going to break all the rules, we're going to use our body in much freer way, in a less technical way. And then, as always happens, the technique came back into it. And then you have things like Cunningham technique, Graham technique, and there's really a focus on more contraction. So there's a lot more going on in the torso. Obviously, ballet is very I don't want to say very rigid, but it feels that way when you're training. And then at some point they tell you, now flow with it, now be artistic. And then all of a sudden you're like, wait, but I haven't moved my hips for all this time, or my shoulders. So there's that part of it. But yes, I also believe that modern can be referred to as what we might call like street dance. So unfortunately, the terms aren't well defined globally because people use them in different ways. But I mean contemporary in the British sense of the word contemporary dance.
Okay. And it's sort of sad in a way, isn't it, that the kind of dance world has so much of this physical pain and dissociation and disembodiment. It's kind of sad.
Yeah, and there's a lot that is all interlaced with that. So, we talked, Mark, when you were on my podcast, about this thing of like the bleeding toes and the pride in the suffering and the pride in the hard work, and that the harder it is for you, the better you must be doing. And then you look in other, when I really opened my eyes and I was like looking around at other things and other dance in other places, and I was like, hold on, but like, does it really need to be like this? And all of a sudden you start to question everything. And that's the moment of freedom, I guess, when you're like, well, hey, what would it look like if ballet got to also feel good as well as looking beautiful and being still hard discipline?
Right. And there is this assumption, I think it's fairly global, you'll definitely find it in Asia. I've seen this in Asian martial arts, for example. Suffering is good, more suffering is better. nothing good comes without suffering. You know, there's some truth in that, discipline, sacrifice, things like that, right?
Yeah.
It's not total bonkers, but it's not also necessarily true. And I've heard martial artists sort of, you know, talk about their hard training and how much they suffered. And it's like, almost because they suffer, they then value it. There's a kind of cognitive dissonance here, the other way around, rather than, you know, necessarily being a good method.
Yeah, I've literally just come off a coaching call with some of my dance teachers, and we were saying this same thing, because this is ingrained in our like brains from dance. This same thing comes up when we're trying to charge for our classes, and we have this idea that more hard work and hours means I can charge more money. And so, yeah, we take these patterns and extrapolate them into our lives. And so I think dance is a good portal to get in and have a look at some of these things that are going on and say, what would it feel like then if ballet got to be more enjoyable? What would it feel like if I was also embodied at the same time as I'm dancing? And you look at the top dancers who really make it and have great careers, and they actually are. And so then you're like, oh, okay, so what's happened here? Because the best dancers know this. And then there's these squished ones in the middle fighting with all of these issues of not being connected, and then all of a sudden asking to communicate something through the dance when you've been using your body like a robot. And so, yeah, there's lots of layers to it, but I realize now just how important embodiment is, not only in dance but in life.
Great. And there are dance schools out there now that, you know, involve a lot of the BMC and Feldenkrais and, you know, kind of somatic and embodied practices. Like, that's also a thing now, right? That there's kind of
totally,
we can't make any generalizations too easily here, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's probably, I believe the majority of dance that is done in the world is very likely to be embodied, because most of it is people dancing with their friends. Most of it's people dancing with their families at weddings and community things, in folklore. And, you know, that's actually the majority of dance. And of course, but I've just been in the performance dance world in those kinds of spaces, which is not the majority. And a lot of those people forget this is not the majority of what dance is. And, you know, even in those spaces, yeah, there's so much more attention now, especially in the ballet world, on like really looking after the physical and mental well-being of their dancers in the companies. And, you know, that's a really beautiful thing. So everything's on the up.
And this has come up in previous conversations with people, that it does bring up the question, like, what is dance, right? Like, because we have this one word, if someone's moving, that's dance, more or less, unless it's functional, you know, they're moving to go somewhere. And like almost anything else is dance. And as you say, the majority of dance has a social function, you know, like your Kayleys from your Scottish side of your family. Yeah. You know, I'm sure the Cypriot side, there's probably equivalents in the Mediterranean. I've seen Israelis do sort of group dances at weddings and things. It's a courtship ritual. You know, a lot of dance has an erotic element to it, at least, you know, whether that's bringing people together or keeping people together, having slight affairs from your main partners and, you know, tango dance for 10 minutes. You know, so there's this sort of, a lot of dance is just joy. Like a kid just jumps up and down as an expressive thing. You know, you don't have to teach a kid that. If you've seen a 2-year-old that can barely stand dance at a wedding or something, you know. So it's a bit weird in a way that this kind of formal dance thing that's a performance on a stage like that, that's the exception if you look across South America, Africa, many cultures.
Exactly. And that's what's been put on a pedestal for people who say, kids who say, I love to dance. Okay, well then you want to be a dancer. That's what you're aiming for. So yeah, it's really interesting that this very natural phenomenon. So my definition of dance is intentional rhythmic movement. For me, the rhythm is a really important part, and it's a part that, depending on who you're talking to, the academic dance world is full of postmodernism, and so the rhythm stuff gets ignored a lot. It gets ignored a lot, and I'm like, hey guys, like if there's no rhythm to it, like potentially let's not define it as dance. And the rhythm can be slow, it doesn't have to be fixed. But you know, if musicians are happy to use, or we're happy to use that in music, we should be happy to use it also in dance. So also for me, there's a really big connection between dance and music in that way. And I know, Mark, you've used these wonderful examples that I love talking about too, such as football fans jumping up and down at the same time or chanting. Like, to me, that is, you know, some kind of dance music connection. And then kids hand clapping games in the playground, this is also all these musical / dance behaviors. They have this same origin. And I love talking about this in the performance dance world, because it just grounds people back into the fact that dance is a human behavior. It's not an, like, it's an art as well. I don't want to say it's not an art. Obviously it is an art, but it's an art second. First is a human behavior.
Nice. And you're involved in the adult ballet world. This is nothing to do with the adult film industry or adult entertainment. So it's a bit of a weird term. Like, you don't have the adult yoga world, but I guess ballet's one of those things that a lot of kids, particularly girls, do. Like, a lot of girls in the West do it a class when they're a kid, and they love it. And at a certain point, they realize they're not going to be a swan. You know, they're not going to be the princess on the stage, so they give up. But that's the normal route, isn't it? And then later in life, they rediscover it. Like, because this is kind of a new thing, the adult ballet movement, I've heard it even called.
Yeah, so there was nowhere for them to go for a while, Mark. It was kind of like, you train to be a pro. If you don't make it to pro, then you go off and do something else and just forget about it. Now, that's a complete over-exaggeration. Like, there have been places in specific cities, in specific places where people can have carried on training. But in the last, I'd say 10 years, it's really taken off, and especially online, because that's where the online adult ballet community was kind of born, the online one, which I was a big part of. And it was, all of a sudden giving adults permission to go back to dance, and especially a dance that's that kind of demanding, and that really you are always aiming for perfection, and yet you know you're not going to get there. So what does that look like as an adult? How do you give yourself permission to go into the journey and be trying to enjoy every class when there's not that end goal of getting into a company and being on stage at the end?
Right. So it's a little bit of, it's kind of like how we look at sports, that it's all just one big funnel that has a few professionals at the end, and everyone else drops out. But, you know, for example, sports, there's lots of guys who play football on a Saturday or a Sunday with their beer bellies, and they run around, they have a good time with all their mates, and they know they're never going to be playing for Manchester United. You know, they're like the Brighton Buddhist Centre has a football team. You know, like it's a kind of normal thing for guys to play a bit of football at the weekend. And, you know, it's for friendship, for fitness, whatever. But this is pretty new around dance. And did it sort of flourish in COVID a little bit? Because it's only the last couple of years I've really started seeing offered adult ballet at different places. Like, I guess it probably sort of brings back a little bit of the sort of joy of childhood, maybe, for people. Say a little bit more.
Yeah, there's so much. I think certainly the online class offerings went up during COVID. From what I understand, and from the other teachers that I'm in contact with, there was a lot of it coming up before those years. But yeah, it's this opportunity for adult, you know, it's such a good example, the football example, Mark, because people understand that, and they're like, well, yeah, of course you're allowed to play football if you're not a pro. Yeah. And then at the same time, someone says, I'm going to train for the marathon. And you're like, okay, cool. And then someone says, I want to start ballet. And they're like, what the hell are you talking about? You can't dance ballet. Look at you. Like, what age are you? You can't lift your leg up there anymore. And it's like, hold on. How can we have all these different kind of standards for different physical activities? So it was really just a celebration of people giving themselves permission to, go back to. And the thing is, yes, some of it is childhood, but some people have never danced ballet before. So it's sometimes it's a return to something that you love. And sometimes it's incredible because people join for so many different reasons. There are people who are really craving structure, who are really craving.
There's a lot of structure. Natalie, just
what can my body do?
Slow down a little bit, not Spanish speed, just because we've got a lot of listeners and English is this. And I'm guilty of this. English is a second language.
Yeah. Okay, sorry guys. I get excited about the dance topic. So people join for the structure. People join for the time to dedicate to their own improvement. Like, what can my body do? And ballets are really, and it's shining light, and also its dark side. It's a great way to track your progress, and so you can take that way too far, or you can really enjoy seeing it because you're going through the same movements each time. Some people find it very meditative, which I could not relate to at all because it was the opposite of that for me. But some people really do find going through these bar exercises, which are the same every time you come back to the bar, as really beautiful way of connecting with their bodies. And so I think it really depends on people's starting points. And there are adults who come in and they want to really focus on technique and they want to push their bodies. There are adults who come in and they want to explore the center work and what it feels like to create beautiful shapes with their arms and move to the beautiful music. I think ballet music is something that draws people in. There's something really beautiful about.
Sorry, is it sort of like classical? Or
classical, yeah, classical. I mean, the typical is Tchaikovsky in class. If you're lucky enough, you have a live pianist. That is another whole magical thing, which I wish all ballet classes could have that. And of course, there's now ballet classes which will bring in elements of modern music or contemporary music or even pop music. But there's something about, again, coming back to this innate connection between dance and music, there's something beautiful about having the permission to move very much in harmony with the music. Because sometimes in contemporary, there was a lot of things of like, this should be a juxtaposition and we should be looking for ways to create tension between the dance and music. And that always felt very unnatural for me. And so there's this really beautiful thing, I think, with ballet where you almost become the music in some ways. And I think a lot of people find that very comforting. And of course, there's also the element of moving with other people. Although ballet is not the best. I like to remind people, like, ballet is not the best one for that. Like, you can totally find it there. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Synchronized movement. I mean, you see a class of people moving their arms together. There is a kind of co-regulatory, there's a beauty in that kind of way people oscillate together, a way that kind of helps us feel the whole nervous system settled, whether it's football or whatever. Okay, what about the kind of control element? Like, there's a way in which, like, I've met a few ballet dancers. I had this fantasy when I was young, like, hey, I want to date a ballet dancer, because there is a certain aesthetic to it. There's an elegance and a poise. I know, that there might be like a feminist critique of that. In fact, I'm sure there is, of kind of a way, standing beautifully. But there is something in that poise that's very, very aesthetic. So that's one thing I'd love to hear more about. And then the other thing there is, like, the ballet dancers I met were a little bit, no, they were a lot uptight and controlling. Like that seems to be an element of it.
Yeah. I believe that ballet very much attracts people who have these control type tendencies and also who have perfectionist tendencies. That has been my experience for most people in my classes. It's the experience of the dance teachers that I work with in coaching. And certainly, because there's a right and wrong way to do everything, Mark. Like, this is not something that's particularly exploratory. And, you even have to almost like earn your right to add anything to the dance, even a little flourish of the wrist. Like, you shouldn't be doing that until a certain level in the old school way of teaching
even
it.
A little wrist movement is.
No. So, through my training at the conservatoire, which I did when I was 26, which is very, very late, I was very lucky that they allowed me to come in. But so old, Mark. The other people in my class were like 15. And so it was very interesting going through that experience, being an adult, with an adult mindset, seeing, there is no room for personal expression yet. And it depends on your teacher as well. I had a very strict teacher. There's no room for personal expression. They really do want little ballet robots, because ultimately in a corps de ballet, like when people go and see Swan Lake, part of the beauty of that is that every single dancer is moving in exactly the same way at exactly the same time. So I understand why there is that training. Yeah. But at the same time, there's room there. I believe there is room, and other teachers prove that there's room to have a little bit of play within ballet. But like, play and ballet, most people would never associate those two words together. So certainly it attracts people, I believe, who are very controlling, because you can control it. You control every single movement of your body at every single time. So this is something that I think we get to heal from if we've been through that as dancers, and it brings something else to your dancing after you've been through that process of saying, what if I don't control? What if I make a mistake? What happens then? Maybe I learn faster, maybe I discover a new way of doing something, but these are real breakthroughs for dancers who've been trained in that very classical way, I think. That might seem very obvious to many of your listeners, Mark, because I'm sure they're much more in touch with what dance can be and the play that can exist within the dance space.
What do you do now then? So you work with dance teachers, like to sort of bring aside this dance background, going through this process. We could talk about perfectionism and control for a long time, I think. But where did it go with you? Like, tell us a little bit more about the sort of second half of the story here.
The journey, yeah. So after I came out of the conservatoire, I realized this is not the way for me. This isn't going to be my way. And I also had a hip injury from forcing turnout. So there's also just a very practical things of ballet, which is you're putting your body in positions which are not natural, and to do that as an adult is also tricky. So I had this insight of how to teach adults from doing the training myself as an adult. So, well, long story short, I created lots of opportunities for adult dancers. I had holidays and retreats for dancers to come and dance with me. We would do actual variations, which is like the solos, because that's another thing. When do you get to dance the real dances and not the military exercises in class? As an adult, you're never going to get to the professional level. So, and that's not to say never, sorry. Some people can if you start
sure, but it's
like
pretty
at 80, very
age.
unusual. Yeah, exactly. And then having gone through all that exploration, having worked with many adult ballet dancers, I then also was training as a coach, and I realized, like I mentioned, that this perfectionism was affecting so many people, both dancers and dance teachers alike. And so that's where, once I'd done enough of the work on myself and I'd implemented it in my own studio, I then started to help other dance teachers and dancers to come through these things. Because there's perfectionism thing, there's real issues with receiving. I'd say in general, receiving, we don't like to receive like criticism because that feels like an attack on us personally, because we've tried everything perfectly. We don't like to receive help because we are very independent and we want to show that we can do everything on our own and everything is our own hard work and that's why we deserve it. We don't believe we can receive money, we can receive worthiness, so many things. And so I just was seeing these patterns and realizing, oh, I can help people with this. And the wonderful thing about working with dancers is that because there is this great connection with the body, and I mean that in the manipulation way, it's actually very quick for dancers to reconnect to actually what's going on once they give themselves that permission, which is very interesting. So that's incredibly rewarding also as a coach.
Yeah, I've seen it work both ways with dancers and performers of various kinds. On the one hand, they've already got an entry into the body at least. They know at least where bits of their body are. Do you know what I mean? And where stuff is. For some, it seems like a sort of negative thing to really get beyond, to not objectify themselves. It's talk about women as sex object, but then there's women as performance object as well. It's object of
absolutely
aesthetic object kind of thing on a stage over there. It's interesting ones about perfectionism. Our Daniela talks about this a lot. My colleague who I work with, who's sort of specialized in, she talks about control enthusiasts, which I think is funny, rather than control freaks. She's kind of reframed it. And because there's a set of gifts there as well, isn't there? There's like these gifts that the conditioning has given you in terms of being on top of your shit, it didn't surprise me you were on time and well dressed and well turned out. And there's a professionalism, there's a togetherness to kind of people that come from that hyper competitive world where, you're late for an interview in a ballet kind of position. There's 100 other girls who are going to get it, So there's gifts Absolutely. There as well, right?
Yeah, I think the self-responsibility one is brilliant in many aspects of life. And so again, as a coach working with dancers or dance teachers, they take stuff very quickly and they take action on it as well. They're not afraid of the discomfort. Sometimes they're afraid of the emotional discomfort, but I just remind them, like, you've dealt with this kind of discomfort in your body before.
Right.
You do it every day in the studio. So this is just from a different source.
You smile when you talk about the suffering. Still actually, martial artists have so much in common. And yet, I think the torture of being a perfectionist it's unachievable, right? Like a perfectionist Absolutely. Will always be unhappy because there's no such thing as perfect in this life. That's an ideal. Yeah. You're literally never there. And as you say, any feedback is threatening. So anything that's, like, hey, maybe an even better if I've had students who are perfectionists and they're hard to teach because if it's not right the first time, they hate themselves, or you're a threat to them if you're kind of seen in that light. Like, it's a really good way to torture yourself, perfectionism.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. And to never be enough. That's the thing, because then you're never ever enough. And it's this drive of, I'm driven from fear instead of I'm driven from a curiosity and an excitement about what it is that I'm doing. And dance is the easy, it's dance, guys. We get to be driven by the joy of doing it and the curiosity and the will to get better, because it's something that we love to do, rather than this fear of I'm never enough, it's never enough what I do. I have to be constantly looking for approval from my superiors, and that's built in, right? That hierarchy is also built in. And then you realize that these lessons you've taken into the rest of your life. And so there I am, constantly looking for validation from my husband, constantly trying to do things perfectly in our relationship. And of course, suffocating the whole thing and ruining very beautiful moments because they weren't what I had anticipated that they should be like. And so, when you start to see the patterns in other places, you're like, maybe I should address this. And dance is one of the ways I think that is a good in, because sometimes it can feel very intense. I didn't start with my marriage. I started with my relationship to dance. And that was something that allowed me to expand it into other areas. But yeah, there's the first process. This first process of allowing yourself to be good enough. And then there's the second process, because people in your life have gotten used to a certain level of expectations of you. And that was almost, they're both hard, but the second one is really uncomfortable. I still have to tell my husband sometimes, listen, I'm so sorry, but I'm not going to do that perfectly. And you're going to have to forgive me, because I'm choosing to forgive myself this time, and I'll do better next time, but I will not torture myself for making a mistake anymore.
People are very reliable who are like perfectionists, aren't they? You kind of got to lean on that. You said a lot of great stuff there. That never enough, the idea of like, okay, I'm never good enough. I can never do enough. There's always more. I'm away from perfection. The piece around and just to generalize this for listeners, like if we're in an embodied practice where approval comes from above, whether that be, sensei, I've seen grown 30-year-old, 40-year-old martial artists just begging for that little scrap of approval from their asshole martial arts teacher who never says anything's any good. Then occasionally, it's very abusive actually in a way to just give out a scrap of praise, that all of a sudden it means something because it's so rare for them to say it. And conditioning oneself to be constantly looking for that approval from outside. And then, as you say, if we recognize that there's a conditioning process happening within the dance studio, it's like it can become a dojoification we're talking about here of the dance. So it's sort of, dance becoming a place for personal growth. Like, okay, what patterns am I working on here? Because maybe it's easier to make a mistake and forgive myself in this little bar exercise. It doesn't really matter anyway, than in my real life with my husband, as you say, where it's all of a sudden it's more real.
Yeah, absolutely. And coming back to this validation thing is that what we're kind of always mirroring, right? So I also noticed that because I was always looking for this approval and things, it was so rare for me to approve other people, because that's how I believed it should be. And so it was really hard for Jordan to get a well done as well, unless it was perfect.
So Jordan's your dog or your husband?
Yeah, it's both.
The husband, both.
No, he's my husband.
Because you're applying that same strict standard to him.
Yeah.
Like, why aren't you like a strict ballet student? Like, this isn't perfect. You haven't done the washing up perfectly. So like, that's a pretty hard tyranny to live under, right? Like if someone's in that environment and they're not trained like you to be conditioned by that, must have been a tough one. How do you get on with Spanish culture? Because you live in Spain now. Well, actually, Catalan culture, isn't it? It's Barcelona, right?
I'm in Madrid. No, I'm in Madrid. Full Spain, yes. It was one of the most healing things I've ever done for myself, Mark, was to move to Spain. And there were incredibly uncomfortable moments, and moments where I was really annoyed by the way the Spanish did things. And then when I looked inside, I was like, this is exactly what I asked for. This is what I needed.
Triggered by that, because I always say, if you want to be a control freak, I lived in Ethiopia, I lived in Brazil, like I had the control, like I was so annoyed so much of the time as a bit of a control freak in those countries, because stuff would be late, stuff would seem disorganized, stuff would be very loose, and I'd be like, yeah. I always say, Italy's fine when I'm on holiday because I can let go of being control freak on holiday, but when for work, it drives me nuts. So it's like, I guess it was just confronting you with that control pattern the whole time.
Absolutely. One of the biggest things for me was around competition, actually. Spaniards are not very competitive. And I was like, what's driving you guys then? I mean, listen, there are, of course, there are competitive Spaniards. Yeah. Like, Nadal. Okay. Of course there are. And of course it exists. But
it's a more cooperative culture generally.
Yeah. And also, they're a very good enough culture. They're like, this is good enough. This is good enough. Let's enjoy it.
Yeah.
And I was like, how dare you stop there? Like, you could be doing more. What about your potential? And what about creating competition within your workplace so that you do more? And they're like, no, we just do enough. And then we go and have drinks with like our friends. And then we go back to our families and have a lovely meal and whatever. And I'm like, oh, this is what I asked for. And so I better look at that stuff inside myself. Yeah.
I've been learning that as well. I'm talking about self too much, but I've been learning that recently as well. Like, having achieved some big things in the world, I just go, I don't feel the need to do it. And I'm just like, maybe it's enough. Maybe that's fine. Maybe we don't need to do Embodiment Conference 3 with 5 million people. Maybe it's all good, baby. It's like, it's nice to let go of that drive sometimes.
Yeah. And yet that's the deepest fear of perfectionists, because it's like, if I let that go and then I stop doing all the things that I thought I had to do for love and approval, what happens to me? And so it's this thing of our safety, of the perfectionism. And I think it's one of the hardest reasons. I think it's one of we fool ourselves as perfectionists as thinking, people say, oh, it's a coping mechanism, but we're like, yeah, but it's the one I want to keep. That's the torture that I want to keep for myself because it's so productive. Mm-hmm. And yeah, once you get to that point, as you just said, of like, yeah, what if I don't have to do that next one though, and get to a point of acceptance? That's the freedom then.
And there's always
the freedom feels scary.
I've met people who are incredibly famous, rich, beautiful. Name your thing that people want more of. I've met them. I've met the top 1% of many of those categories, and then a lot of them aren't happy because the reason they got to that top 1% is because they were constantly pushing a thing, and then there was always more. And actually, I think a lot of our heroes, like, what does it take to become a famous actor or a famous sports person? You got to be a bit nutty. You've got to be driven. I remember seeing a thing that was about a famous basketball player. It's this thing I'm watching on YouTube, and it's like, if you train for 3 hours, he would turn up at training early and not leave until you finished, just to show you that he would train for 4 hours. And they were talking about this like this is a really great trait. And I was going, this guy's a dickhead. This guy's a psychotic. Like, this is not normal behavior. And yet, do you really want to be in that 0.0001% of guys who become in the NBA, or business people who become CEOs? Like, people are like, what does it take to become a CEO? It's like, you don't want that. People think they want that. You don't fucking want what it takes to be a CEO. Like, just being a CEO of a small company's destroyed me at times. It's like, I don't know. I just think we're putting unhealthy people into positions where we go, right, now they're the people we should be like.
Yeah, and that's what we see, and that's what gets spread on social media, because it looks all glamorous and it looks all fancy, and we don't see any of the dark side behind it. Whereas when we lived in communities, we would be aware of all the other stuff, like their marriage falling apart and other things. Like, maybe that's not the way I want to go, but because we only see half of it, we're like, oh, that looks great.
Yeah, we see the influencer with 7% body fat, who's, super muscly or super skinny or whatever. We don't see their miserable, starving themselves, their broken relationships because they can't go out for food, their health problems from lack of body fat. We don't see any of that. We just see the pretty picture that's probably airbrushed on top of that. And we don't realize that person's a massive dickhead the rest of the time, and I'm in contact with a lot of people. I sort of get to see behind the screen a little bit sometimes, like we did a training together. In 5 days, people come out. You can't fake it for 5 days, particularly like long days, eating together, dancing together. You can't fake it. And then you go, oh, okay, that's who you are when you're not on Zoom. You can be anyone on Zoom for an hour. Well, I got a Zoom call after this. I can turn it on. What do you want me to be for an hour? Fucking just tell me.
Same on a date as well, right? Because it's like, here's my best self. And then all of a sudden you like live with this person. Who are you? Yeah. The sooner we can be ourselves, the better.
First trip away together with someone, you see a different side of them. You know, my wife and I were long distance dating for a while, and then it's like, okay, then we're like, right, before we move countries, we spent 3 weeks together living in an Airbnb in Poland. And we were like, let's just spend like a few weeks together and see. And it's like, okay, in that case, it worked out fine. But I definitely saw another side of her in 3 weeks. You know, you can't keep up an act for that long.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Smart.
All right. I was looking through our sort of subject list, and evolution is on there for some reason. I didn't quite understand this one, Nat. Is this like one of your areas? What's the
So my master's is in dance anthropology, and I specialize in evolution because I believe it's a useful lens for looking at life. Sure. When it comes to any of the why questions, when we're talking about humans, like there's the how question. You can get a lot done with the how question, just with mechanisms and various other scientific approaches. But if you want to know the whys of things, evolution is a really useful perspective. And so my big question was like, why do humans dance? I was fascinated by this question.
That's a good question. What's the answer?
From very early. I wasn't allowed to explore it during my degree because of the postmodernism thing, and they were like, we don't ask those questions. And then finally my master's,
slow down a minute now.
Yeah.
Postmodernism thing, what do you mean?
So in my degree, my teachers were very much of the idea that in dance, we do not ask those kinds of scientific questions. There's no place for it here. Dance is all about what we want it to be and what we say it is in any moment. And I was like, yeah, but there's some kind of universal truth about dance. And they were like, don't go there.
So the primary side of postmodern meaning like subjective is primary. It's all about experience. You can't actually work anything out. There's no such thing as truth. Yeah.
There you go. That's it.
Oh God, is that taking over dance as well? It's bad enough it's in social sciences. I didn't realize that was in the dance world.
Maybe it's changing. I mean, I did my degree, I don't know, like 15 years ago, I guess I started. So it might have changed. At least when it was like that. And then finally, when I did my master's, I had this permission to like, you're allowed to ask that question. I was like, yes, finally. So when I came to literature, I had to use a lot of music stuff because dance scholars hadn't asked this question. So what I discovered was that dance and music are fundamentally connected. And what I argued in my dissertation was that they come from the same source, which is rhythmic movement. If we think that music, in order to produce any music, whether you're drumming, even singing, like rhythmic movement of the larynx, right? And so I came to realize the question was, okay, so how is this useful for humans? If it wasn't useful, it wouldn't have been there. And on top of that, music and dance both take up a lot of energy. Our ancestors in abundant food.
Calorie burning. And calories are life, right? In this sort of starvation environment. Yeah. So what's the use of it then?
You already touched on so many of them, Mark, at the beginning. So there's affective, that dance and music are affective. And this, I realized, it links to co-regulation, which you talked about after, and I was like, this is a new way of framing it. So affective, meaning that it affects our physiological and emotional states.
So it's self-regulatory practice, right? We feel good, and that's a positive thing. I'm going to be more able to be my evolutionary best self if I'm doing some and we've all experienced that. I go dancing once a week at 5 Rhythms afterwards. I'm having good ideas. I feel good. And then the co-regulatory piece there, that it connects the tribe, I guess, and I've seen that in Africa and other places. Like there's got to be a co-regulatory piece there as well. Yeah,
absolutely. And so by doing the same movements at the same time to the same music, you're going to be sharing a similar state, emotional state and physiological state. So it was really interesting to take your framework and see how that fitted onto that. It's dance and music were massively used for motivation. So things like before a hunt or before some kind of like
anything we need energy for to sort of
Exactly.
pump us. I mean, you do that at the gym, don't you? Put the music on, like I'm nodding my head. It's a little dance. I'm like, right, fucking, I'm gonna lift this weight. You know, getting the energy up. You know, and
Yeah.
like before a war kind of thing. Like you definitely see tribes do that. You know, kind of get it going.
Exactly. And it's really interesting that you say, you know, putting music on in the gym. Again, people will so in training is when you synchronize your movement to the beat of the music, or you synchronize your movement to someone else's movement, but there's always this underlying pulse. That's what differentiates it from just like going around moving in daily life. You don't have a pulse there. And so we still use these fundamental drives of dance, but we just don't call it dance anymore. If you're in the gym and you're doing weights to the beat of the music, I would argue that comes from the root of dance, right? So there's that, and this big motivational piece. Then there's social cohesion, which you've also just talked about, Mark. This idea that by moving together with this, sharing this same underlying pulse, you know, it's really incredible when you see young children. You don't have to teach them that. Babies feel that rhythm. So this is ingrained in us. And that's how I knew, like, there's something here. This is not, so there's a very famous psychologist called Steven Pinker who called dance, or I think he didn't even talk about dance. He's like, dance doesn't deserve to be talked about. Music, he called auditory cheesecake. So just something that came from our language faculties that just happened to be something that like tickles us, like cheesecake.
Wow,
and of course,
degrading.
Yeah, totally. And so luckily things have moved on since then, and we understand, no, very potentially music and dance preceded language. The problem with dance is that it leaves no traces, right, in the fossil records. We have found a bone flute from 40,000 years ago. So we can pretty much guess music will be a lot before then, because the first thing they're going to do is not going to be create a bone flute once they've kind of been having music practices.
Hitting the ground. And sort of tribe, you know, there's this saying from neuroscience, which you can sort of steal from, like, you know, tribes that move together, stay together, something like that. And then the courtship part as well, right? Like when I've seen this in Africa, I've seen like guys like doing their sexy dances and the girls like looking at them, assessing them, you know, like this is the sort of peacocking side of dance, right? Like, is this person a fit mate? It's kind of like, okay, I want to see the move. That's a pretty basic thing. You see someone move and you're like, okay, this is someone who's gonna be good to breed with, right? I guess that's another aspect.
Yeah, so let me come back to that in a second. So for the social cohesion, there was a really interesting study they did with children, and they had a group of children, they read them a story, and then they also did a different experience, which was a musical experience. So they were moving and creating rhythms together. And they found that time after time, the rhythm group were more collaborative after, like the children just played better together, which is really interesting, because I think a lot of the time we think, oh, language is the thing, we all have to agree on the same story, that's what's going to keep us together. But this is like on a cognitive level. But when you have literally felt together in time and space with other people, that's what dance and music offer us. So that's a big part of the social cohesion one. And then this other aspect of sexual selection, which people forget, this is a really big part of evolution. It's not just about survival of the fittest. There's this whole other thing going on with sexual selection. And the peacock is a great example. Why does it have this tail, which is terrible for its survival? You know, that's very hard to get away from predators, etc. But this is because the female peacocks have chosen that because it's a display of health. I have extra energy to put into this tail, therefore I must be healthy. And so here we go with the dance for human beings. Hey, look how much energy I can expend in the dance. And then it's also an opportunity, of course, to show things like, look at my strength, look at my agility. And there's even something more amazing in partner dances, which is, look how good I am in training to your rhythm and being responsive to how you're moving. I mean, Mark, this is me extrapolating because I haven't found any studies on this, but if we also just think of the act of mating, that is synchronous rhythmic movement also. And so for me, it doesn't surprise me that dance is related to that. And yet, you know, when I talk about this in some dance spaces, Mark, people hate it. People hate the idea.
It's try before you buy. It's obviously try before you buy. It's like, you can't move across the dance floor together. Like, you know, I mean, good sex, there's a certain amount, you know, pelvis is moving in union. Like there's the sort of reading of each other's signals, you know, even ahead of the physical side of things. Well, of course that's there. I mean, this is common sense. Like, I think it was common sense to our grandparents even, actually. And dancing
Absolutely.
was very normal for anyone that's over 60. So.
Yeah, totally. But then it's not this art on a stage, Mark. That's the problem. Like, it doesn't fit with that model. But it's like, we can have these two things existing at the same time. You want to use it as ethereal art, great, take it and do that. But at the same time, for me, it's like, well, let's not deny reality of where dance came from, what it was used for. And totally this opportunity as well of, yeah, try before you buy. That's such a funny way of putting it, but that's exactly right. Of how do we move together? How do we respond to each other's needs on the dance floor?
It's a job interview, isn't it? Yeah. It's a taster.
How do we smell? Yeah.
You got to date someone before you smell them. After 3 minutes of tango with someone, you're like, okay, this person can't listen. They don't smell good. I don't count with them. This is a bad idea. Okay, we need to wrap up fairly soon. Right? Maybe a lot of this does stem from just having this one word for all these different things. Like, it's not like no one ever fell in love with a prima ballerina, is it? Do you know what I mean? It's not like the average sort of dance star gets a million offers of marriage a week, roses thrown at them. So it's not that hidden.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, exactly.
We do need to, Natalie, where do people find you? I don't have your website handy. Where do people find you on the interweb?
So my name, natalieorr.com, is my website, and Instagram is my favorite place to connect with people, just because we get to chat in the DMs and things. That's at Natalie Dancer, but if you just put my name in Natalie Orr, you'll find me too.
Like gold, right? So that's O-R-R.
Exactly, O-R-R, yes. Good old Scottish surname. That used to be the bane of my life.
Was there you are on the gram. So is that a Scottish name with the gold?
The double R.
Cool. All right, Natalie, do you have a closing message about dance or anything else to wrap us up for today?
I think it would just be that dance is for everyone. It's never too late, and that whether or not your culture believes that it's more for women or more for this type of body or whatever, it's not. Dance is there for you. Find the right teacher who's welcoming, and don't get turned off if you walk into the wrong class and it's the wrong vibe. Just try again, because that's a beautiful opportunity for us to connect with other people, connect with ourselves, and connect with music.
Natalie, you've tempted me to put on a tutu and give. I've been seriously tempted to help ballet a bit of a go. So thanks so much for doing this today.
Thank you, Mark.